So welcome to the ADSA Education SIG meeting. Today we're going to be talking about collecting and curating open data sets for data science education and research. The reason this topic is on the agenda is that over the last year that I've been working with this community, this is a topic that keeps coming up, right? We have a lot of, especially in the data science educational setting, in classes and class assignments, but also for things like capstone projects, we have this kind of recurring need for data sets that are well curated and that people can kind of jump right into and start using for their work. So what we wanted to do was to have a conversation today about what it would look like to put together a corpus of data sets that could be broadly available for use for these purposes, and how we would go about kind of moving the ball forward on a project like that. So the way that we're going to structure the conversation today is as some breakout rooms. So we'll break folks into rooms of about 3 or 4 people. In the notes document there are some breakout room discussion prompts that I'd like folks to cover, but those don't have to be the only things that you talk about in the breakout room. Feel free to kind of range far and wide as long as you're kind of orbiting around the topic at hand. So what that will look like is we'll break out into rooms here in a minute. I'd like you to make sure to identify a note taker for your breakout room. Take notes in the agenda document that's linked in the chat right now. And after we've had some time for breakout room discussion, we'll come back and your note taker or someone in your group will sort of report out on where things landed in your conversation, and then we will have a little bit of a group discussion about what to do to move forward on a project like this. So with that in mind, do folks have any questions about the structure or the topic or any of that, or should we just kind of move into breakout room land and see where we get? Everybody's still on mute means there are no questions. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to, yes, please take this is in the chat, please take notes in the agenda document so that we can kind of have all of that content in one place. And I'll drop the link one more time. I'm going to float sort of between rooms and then back here just in case somebody pops in at a later time. I want to be able to assign them to a room. So you might see me coming and going because that's what I'm here for. Okay, so I'm going to break us out into breakout rooms. Everybody has their prompts and the notes document. Good luck, best wishes, and we'll see you back here in about 30 minutes. So here we go. Let's do
said, you should probably pop into this meeting. I'm not really sure. I wasn't even sure what I was going to be in for.
Yeah.
But if you would prefer not to, I can make myself do it.
Yeah, if it's okay with you to take notes, I think that would be
Okay.
better.
So I guess we should
because
do
of my. Pardon me?
I was just gonna say we should do introductions, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can go ahead and go first. Peter Freeman, I'm an associate teaching professor at Carnegie Mellon. And as hinted at before, I got an email from Rebecca Nugent, who's also here, basically saying, we should go to this. And that's basically all she told me. And so I had no more expectations as to what was going to go on. I will say that I teach a introduction to, I call it Introduction to Statistical Research Methodology, but it's really Introduction to Statistical Practice for sophomores. And we use canned data sets, and I have on GitHub something like 15 curated data sets that are available publicly.
Well, that's excellent.
And I could, at any time, point ADSA to those data sets, and they can be, you could take all the ones you want. They all have README files that I've written because my background's in astrophysics. They're all astronomically related. And so they should have sufficient detail for just about anyone to be able to drop in and start doing analysis.
Perfect. Can you make sure to capture that in the notes?
Yes.
And I'm going to swap to another room, but it looks like you guys are kind of on the right track.
Yeah, this is
Up and down while I was trying to take notes. That was hard to do. So I'll take it and then I'll copy and paste it over.
Yeah,
good enough.
Other rooms will be writing as well, so that's probably why it jumps.
So, hey, Steve.
Hey.
Yeah. And I will let you all know that toward the end of our discussion time, I actually have to hop off. I have to help run a session at the ESIP meeting this afternoon. So
no problem.
But really happy to be part of the discussion now.
Perfect.
Okay, so it looks like we have basically 4 items to discuss. Generally, what are our thoughts on this topic? The size and type of what a corpus of open data sets, open and available data sets would look like. And then how, that's 2. Third is to talk about a process for finding, collecting, and curating this corpus. How does it stay updated? Who's responsible for this? And then how to evaluate. Both, I suppose that means in terms of the veracity of the corpus and also how it's being used, right?
Yeah. So
those are all excellent topics. Just to give you, just to give everybody a sense of where I'm coming from. So I was at NYU for a while. I moved down to the University of Delaware now. I run a facility called the Urban Observatory.
But still well documented so that people can run different models and stuff on is becoming increasingly more difficult to find, and things that were open are becoming increasingly closed.
And so this is a topic I think a lot about. I don't know if you're familiar with NEON, the National Ecological Observatory Network, but we are an open data project funded by the National Science Foundation with data, collected in standardized methods across the country and provided free for researchers and educators. And one of my roles is to try to, facilitate the use of this data in education, focused in undergraduate and graduate.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. I had a talk with one of my students yesterday who is finishing her health policy certificate. It's a graduate certificate, so she's interested in graduate level work. And she told me that she's interested in pursuing a doctoral program in data science, but as a way to kind of get her feet.
Cool. So we're back from breakout rooms. So if we could have someone from each of those rooms or those little discussion groups give us like a couple-minute overview, and then we can kind of talk about next steps and where we think we go from here. So who was in breakout room 1? Let's see here. That was Megan, Yasmin, Rick, and Jing.
I can go ahead and report out since my name was first on the list. This is Megan Jones. So we talked a lot about kind of the challenges around data sets, and in particular, how do you figure out what's worthwhile for the community? Do these need to be, I'm like, a lot of the faculty needs vary as far as how clean they need to be, what domain it is, what do they need to be, and do we need to think about data sets in conjunction with specific learning objectives or teaching modules around them or curricular needs? And then we also face challenges for researchers to share their own data as data sets, and the time and personnel required to really apply that curation to data sets at institutions, or maybe prohibitive for many faculty or institutions on their own data or on the data that they're using.
Great.
Any questions on that?
I guess I have a quick question. So did you guys discuss whether it makes more sense to try to curate new reusable open data sets in one place? Is that something ADSA should do versus something that came up in our group, and I'm talking next, like having more of a resource where you point to already open data sets?
I would say we talked around the issue. We did talk about, are we just looking at something like Kaggle and these large repositories for open data that have, some varying levels of quality control associated with them? Or do we think the answer lies more in something that's more rigid? You could define that in a lot of ways. I don't think we discussed that a lot, but anyone from my group's welcome to jump in.
Kayla, do you want to go ahead with group 2, and we can come back to any of these topics?
Yeah, sure. So we started with one of Rachel in our group mentioned as sort of it was actually a really nice sort of introduction to our conversation, that she had a student who was looking to enter a PhD program in data science, but wanted to have an opportunity to get a little bit of experience on her own with R or Python, and that just finding some data sets to play with on your own was really difficult. There's formal programs out there like Coursera, but if you just want a data sets to do some self-teaching, or maybe teaching in a more casual online learning experience, that was really challenging. And so I think that framed our conversation more than anything, to say, how do we overcome that? How do we provide resources for somebody who does want to just jump in and kind of do some self-teaching and some learning? Obviously, these data sets could also be used in more formal applications. And then we did also move on to say, well, what does that look like practically? And so a starting point could be a landing page where ADSA curates links to available data sets that are already out there, right? But then to even go a step further and not just list a bunch of links, but also annotate it in some way. So there should be some information about the structure of the data, the kinds of questions you could answer with the data. Maybe go so far as to say there should be a data dictionary for each of these data sets, to say, what are the fields, what are the, what's in there. And further also to focus not just on very heavily pre-processed data sets that are out there, for example, like Kaggle, but the fact that there needs to be also data sets that are messy, right? There's often the ones that are used in teaching have already been pre-processed so much, it removes that 70 to 80% of data science, which is the processing and the data cleaning, right? So having data sets that allow for that learning experience as well would be important. Let's see, then we talked a little bit about having a metric or a classification system for the messiness of the data, but we didn't really go into what that looks like. Two of the folks in our group were public health and or privacy related, so we did spend some time on EHR, electronic health record data, and the problem with privacy and identifiable data, but still the need for being able to learn data science and data science tools around that type of data. So a couple of options are creating synthetic data with that has a very similar structure to these data sets. It sounds like a lot of EHR data is in all different kinds of formats and scattered across all different platforms and organizations. So even just having a centralized resource that has some points to some open examples of synthetic data where people can learn how to work with these kinds of formats would be useful. And then we did also talk a little bit, getting back to, well, two things. One is that many of these data sets do require some amount of domain expertise. And how do we avoid kind of, that sort of led to this idea of how do we avoid misuse of data sets and any kind of problematic interpretations, right? Whether or not we are the data stewards, even if we're pointing to these data sets, you know, things like we should have some guidelines. There's already existing resources that have guidelines around the use of a data set. So include guidelines on use, include an accompanying guide around the ethical uses. And there are some apparently also data use agreements we could look at around that topic. And then I don't know that we came to any kind of consensus or really dug in too much to whether ADSA should be the actual data curators or holders of data, because there are so many data repos that do already exist. But one instance that would make sense, this was a kind of pie in the sky suggestion, is that it might be an opportunity for ADSA to bring together the collective voices here to see if companies, organizations, or governments might be interested in sharing some anonymized data with us. So any one university that goes to a company and asks for, you know, I don't know, airline competition data or some kind of data that a company may not be very willing to share with one organization, as a larger group, if we could, maybe there's some leverage there. And again, that does have some risks depending on the types of data, with anonymizing and the fact that some data can be re-anonymized. No.
Re-identified.
Re-identified.
Yeah. We could also re-anonymize it.
We could sure. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Does anybody else from my group want to add anything?
Let's jump over to group 3, who didn't take notes. Oh my goodness.
Yes, no, my apologies. I was taking notes in another document. I will copy and paste it over.
Excellent.
The document was jumping up and down as I was trying to type things. So let's see. So our group talked about a lot of different things, some of which we've already touched on here. So I think first of all, we started off discussing data from government's open data, available open data portals that currently exist. And then the question came up about whether or not, you know, ADSA would want to host the data itself versus serve as sort of like a glue for a lot of the available data that's out there. We discussed a little bit about if to host it yourself would take a lot in terms of just resources for pushing around large volumes of data, but then also maintenance and dedicated people for access and those kinds of things. We then had an extended discussion about the importance of keeping in mind the heterogeneity of data as it comes in. So we talked a little bit about standards and how something that might be useful would be for ADSA to sort of take part in the standards discussion that is going on in many different places, right? So there's lots of different standard discussions that are going on in many different domains. But for ADSA to sort of take part in the standards discussion, central to some of that is the heterogeneity of data. And even just as we talked about, even just open data portals and governments are, are an example of this, right? You have geospatial data, you have free text sometimes, you have handwritten text sometimes, you have tabular data, you have varying levels of privacy issues associated with those, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are discussions about standards that are that go on, and so maybe solidifying some of that, especially if ADSA was going to form the glue for some of the open data sets that exist out there. This led into a discussion that we had about the importance of domain scientists and domain researchers and domain practitioners that are essentially that are essential to this whole process. There was actually, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but Tamara also pointed out that there was this question of, so how does a researcher actually get information about a data set that is essential for their use in that data set, right? So if I just go and I just grab some public health records data and run some machine learning algorithms on it, or have my students run some machine learning algorithms on that, there's a whole bunch of issues with that that we also talked about, and I'll mention in a minute. But it can, it's very important to have folks who are creating this data, who are curating this data, and who are dealing with this data on a day-to-day basis, and actually know the domain from which the data comes, to be able to sort of key into the folks who are using the data. So one idea we had is that maybe ADSA could serve as a facilitator for some of those conversations. If a data set is available and it's coming from either a government entity or maybe an academic that doesn't consider themselves a data scientist or something like that, having some of the folks at ADSA have, set up conversations and discussions with them about, supplying some information about data sets that are useful for people who are going to use it, right? So what does the data contain, both in terms of its features, which we were talking about are really important for making sure everybody sort of understands that when they're looking at a data set, but then also how it can be used. What are some example use cases? What are the, if you run standard algorithms on it, what kind of output can you expect? What can you learn? What are things that are known that you can learn from this data, right? What kind of work has already been done on it, et cetera. A couple of other things that we brought up to expand a little bit on the privacy and re-identification issues. One of the things that I was talking about was that I don't think it ends there. So there are, especially with some of the open data sets that even open data sets that exist now, let alone data sets that we might be interested in pulling in that are not yet open, there are many ethical, legal, privacy, social justice issues that need to be considered. And so perhaps having a dedicated subgroup or subcommittee, or however ADSA wants to sort of put these things together, to keep an eye on those kinds of issues right from the jump, right? So there have been a couple of very sort of high-profile instances recently of faculty using crime data in ways that have been pretty suspect for introductory data science classes and things like that, as an example, right? There's just a couple of last things. One, as we mentioned, there are a lot of open data sources already available. So what are the roles of the folks who are already curating those in what ADSA is trying to do here? University libraries, for example, librarians have a long history of doing this kind of thing and a deep knowledge in this area. So, pulling it, making sure that we keep up those conversations as well, also important. The fact that the users of the data set will have tiered experience, right? Some of them will be sort of power users who have done a lot of machine learning and done a lot of data, worked with a lot of data in the past, of very different types of data. Some users will be totally brand new, and so making that access available to folks who have different levels of entry is probably important. And then I guess the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is, we talked about this concept of having actually two issues that we might want to tackle at the same time. One is a corpus or whatever of a bunch of data sets and curating that, but then also sort of a case studies that are available, like a set of case studies that are available to junior faculty who are maybe teaching a data science course for the first time and want to say, okay, well, what is available out there that I could use for my course or something like that? Or new students, they can just talk about who need data sets that they want to try new things out on, but they have a hard time finding it. So, Stephanie Hicks has this open case studies project that's going on. It's really great. So maybe having a corpus that has a sort of parallel sort of case studies that can quickly be used by lots of folks might be useful. That's it.
Yeah, and we invited Stephanie to be here, but she's swamped, so she couldn't make it today. But we want to fold her into that conversation. Let's get to the last group for report out real quick, and then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps.
Okay, so group 4, the advantage of going last is we can say that everyone's already talked about everything we talked about, but that's kind of a lie. So a lot of things that have been talked about are things that we did talk about, but as far as things I'd want to highlight is we would want to have data sets, not necessarily all data sets, but at least a substantial proportion that can be used to illustrate non-methodological aspects of data science, like reproducibility, ethical dimensions and such. We're having kind of a running commentary about my astrophysics background. Galaxies don't care about ethics, so we don't have to worry about them. But for Thomas, who's working in neuroscience and such, ethics plays a big role. And one idea that came out of that kind of not directly, but indirectly, is that perhaps every data set should have a discussion board associated with them so that those who use the data set can come online, ask questions, make commentary, do whatever a discussion board engenders. Another thing that came out of our group was Kate showed us the Corgis website, which I had not been familiar with. The URL is given in the notes, and it is a collection of data sets, and it illustrates a possible structure. It shows the topic areas. If you click on the topic areas, you will see that you'll be taken to tables that show column information, etc. But then the question is this the sort of thing that ADSA wants? Do you want a single maintainer who can enforce some sort of uniformity of appearance throughout the data sets? Or do you want the contributors to be the maintainers of the data sets where you might have a bit of fraying in the uniformity, so to speak? Hold on a very quick second, because someone has rang our doorbell and my daughter is calling up to me. Good time to Zoom. I'll be right back.
No worries.
Carry on the conversation. I'll jump back in a second.
Perfect. Yeah, so what it's sounding to me like is we have a fair bit of convergence in topics across the breakout rooms, which is great. It's sort of what I was hoping for. And I think that because we're running up against the hour, what I would like to do is to take the notes from this meeting and distill them and send them back out to certainly the group of folks who were here on the call, but to the wider community as a report out. And then I think that it's probably appropriate at this point to try to form a working group to continue this discussion and try to kind of formalize some of the things that we've talked about today and determine how best to move forward. So expect to hear from me probably next week with some distillation and that call for participants, and consider whether you would be able to spend a little bit of time working on this. You know, the time commitment is sort of a question at this point. Or if you know somebody who would be a good, that you could strong arm into participating in a working group, you could nominate them too. So that sounds like probably a good set of next steps. Any final pearls of wisdom or parting shots anybody wants to make on the topic before we wrap up? I tried to make that as awkward as possible. Okay, so yeah, expect to hear from me next week with some distillation, and we'll look forward to having more conversations about this because I think there's a lot of interest here. So thanks everyone, and Gregory, could you make sure to drop the notes in the doc?
Yep.
Awesome.
Happening now. All right.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.